For the 20 years ending 12/31/2022, the average investor returned 3.5%, while the S&P 500, the largest 500 US companies, returned about 9.6%. Tell me how that makes sense. The same stats continue to happen time and time again because people think they're smarter than the market and they can outpace the index, which we keep finding out we can't. So why do people continue to do this? I'm gonna teach you what my top 5 index funds are, why I love these, and how you can build a portfolio similar. And I will mention that I don't actually own all of my top 5 indexes because there's a lot of overlap and it wouldn't make sense for me to own all 5 of these funds. So I'm gonna pause right here to remind you, do not copy my portfolio as it does not make sense for you. But take the wisdom, take the knowledge, and take the frameworks away from this video so that you can actually build your own portfolio. And as a quick note, if you're working with Fidelity or Charles Schwab, this video is pertaining to Vanguard. So when I talk about the 5 particular funds, I'm referring to Vanguard. Therefore, if you buy these funds at a different broker, heads up, a $75 transaction fee could be coming your way. So make sure you find the equivalent of the Vanguard fund at the particular broker you're working with. So the fund that lands number 1 on my list is VTSAX or VTSAX. Also, the ETF version is VTI. So with VTSAX, you're encompassing the entire US stock market. That's small cap, mid cap, and large cap stocks. You're gonna get a nice blend of the entire US market, and the expense ratio is only 4 basis points, meaning for every $10,000 invested, you're only spending $4. And as a rule of thumb, I personally never go over 20 basis points when selecting investments. So the number of stocks in this fund, and it can vary from time to time, is 3,980, and that's a combination of growth, value, small, mid, and large cap stocks. And the top 5 stocks in this index are Apple, Microsoft, Amazon, Nvidia, and Google. And the US stock market encompasses about 50% of the global market, so this is a great fund to take advantage of. My personal portfolio consists of about 73% of VTSAX. But remember, what I do does not always make sense for you. The second index that lands on my list is VFIX, and this is the S&P 500. And in fact, I don't actually own this fund. And the reason why is because VTSAX has VFIX or the S&P 500 within it. So therefore, if I own both, there's just a lot of overlap between the two and it wouldn't really make sense for me to do so. At the same time, it wouldn't really hurt. It just wouldn't really make a lot of sense. So with this fund, you're gonna get the largest 500 US stocks, but you're not gonna take advantage of the mid cap or small cap funds that you also get with VTSAX. And this fund, as crazy as it is, holds 507 stocks because of parent companies. So therefore, most people think it's actually 500, but Google, for example, has a parent company, Alphabet, and they're listed twice on the index. And there's a lot of overlap between number 1, VTSAX, and number 2, VFIX. So it may make sense to choose one of the two. And VFIX, for every $10,000, it is a $4 charge or 4 basis points as an expense ratio. And to save you time, the top 5 stocks will be the same as number 1. And I believe owning either VTSAX or VFIX, essentially the total US stock market or the total S&P 500, is a great core holding for most people. But again, it might not make sense. Number 3 on my index fund list is VTIAX. And this is one of my favorite international holdings as it has developed and emerging markets within one fund. It encompasses the entire international landscape. While the US economy does account for about 50% of the global market, you can't forget about international funds. And I know JL Collins says VTSAX is essentially owning the whole world because US companies operate internationally, but I disagree with that. I believe there's other gold out there to have. And I like to be a global investor and have exposure everywhere. Now, this is slightly more expensive at 11 basis points. So therefore, every $10,000 invested, it's $11. So you have a $7 more charge every $10,000. Not the end of the world. And again, it's below the 20 basis points. So the number of stocks in this fund is 7,621. This is a mix of Europe, Pacific, Middle East, and emerging markets. So this is an investor's paradise. As a global investor, I do believe it's important to buy the whole haystack. And there's also a lot of risk present, like market risk, political risk, or even currency risk. And I believe not accounting for the other 50% of the world is extremely short-sighted. And if you look back in history, international and domestic fight for the top spot quite often, and there are ebbs and flows in the returns of each. And my personal portfolio consists of 21% of VTIAX. My number 4 index fund is VMAX or VEMAX. And this fund is going to invest in companies in emerging markets like Brazil, Russia, India, China, etc. And stocks and companies in emerging markets are going to have a lot more volatility, but that can come with a lot of upside. I believe this is a great fund for long-term risk-tolerant investors that want some international exposure. And some of the brightest minds in the world, such as Ray Dalio, love emerging markets. And even though the global economies are more interconnected than ever, I still think owning a little bit of emerging markets or even an international fund make a lot of sense. And in fact, the Vanguards, Fidelities, Charles Schwab's of the world do predict that international does outperform domestic over the next decade. Of course, nobody really knows that, and even these guys are wrong 50% of the time. VMAX does have a higher expense ratio at 14 basis points, but below 20 basis points, which is my rule of thumb. It owns 5,235 funds. And the top 5 stocks in this fund are Taiwan Semiconductor Manufacturing, Tencent Holdings, Alibaba, Meituan, and Reliance Industries. My personal portfolio consists of 1.5% of VMAX. My last but not least index fund on the list is VTWAX, or the total world. So this is an investor's dream to basically select one fund and own the entire world of equities. You have developed in emerging markets from an international perspective, and you also have all of domestic, all in one fund. The number of stocks in this fund is over 8,000. And I'll spare you more time because the top 5 stocks in this fund are exactly the same as VTSAX and VFIX, number 1 and 2 on the list. That's how dominant the S&P 500 is and why those top companies are always sitting at the top of multiple different indexes. And I personally love VTWX, but I don't own it. But here's why. VTWAX is broken down by 60% US, 30% all international, and 10% emerging markets. And my personal portfolio consists of 73% of VTSAX, 21.5% of VTIAX, 1.5% of VMAX, 2% of crypto, and 2% of meta stock. However, VTIX owns 25% of emerging markets. So my true exposure is 73% of VTSAX, 16% international excluding emerging markets, 7% emerging markets, 2% crypto, and 2% meta stock. And that total equals 100%. So why don't I just select VTWAX? I personally like to use a 3 index fund mix so I can control the expense ratio, and there's a weighted average expense. So VTWAX's expense ratio is 10 basis points. But if I divvy it up amongst 3 and there's a weighted average expense ratio applied to all 3 funds, because of the exposure I have in each individual fund, I actually save 4 basis points on my overall expenses, and that's why I do 3 funds. So of course, this is a long-term untouchable model, but as I age and my risk changes, my allocations will change accordingly. And that's why you can't rely on this video to select your own portfolio or to even copy it, because it might not make sense. In fact, it probably doesn't. So let's wrap this up. I provided 5 of my favorite index funds, but I only own 3 of my 5 favorite, because there's a lot of overlap, exposure, and correlation, and it wouldn't make sense for me to own all 5. So as you're thinking through your portfolio, don't just copy this, but learn from it and educate yourself so that you can make better decisions in your portfolio.